the most hated new god, the most hated new gods, a most hated new god, the most hated new goddess, the most hated new goddesses, a most hated new goddess, the most hated old god, the most hated old gods, a most hated old god, the most hated old goddess, the most hated old goddesses, a most hated old goddess, the most hated greater god, the most hated greater gods, a most hated greater god, the most hated greater goddess, the most hated greater goddesses, a most hated greater goddess, the most hated lesser god, the most hated lesser gods, a most hated lesser god, the most hated lesser goddess, the most hated lesser goddesses, a most hated lesser goddess, the most hated greater spirit, the most hated greater spirits, a most hated greater spirit, the most hated lesser spirit, the most hated lesser spirits, a most hated lesser spirit, the most hated major god, the most hated major gods, a most hated major god, the most hated major goddess, the most hated major goddesses, a most hated major goddess, the most hated minor god, the most hated minor gods, a most hated minor god, the most hated minor goddess, the most hated minor goddesses, a most hated minor goddess, the most hated superior god, the most hated superior gods, a most hated superior god, the most hated superior goddess, the most hated superior goddesses, a most hated superior goddess, the most hated inferior god, the most hated inferior gods, a most hated inferior god, the most hated inferior goddess, the most hated inferior goddesses, a most hated inferior goddess, the most hated ancestor god, the most hated ancestor gods, a most hated ancestor god, the most hated ancestor goddess, the most hated ancestor goddesses, a most hated ancestor goddess, the most hated ascendant god, the most hated ascendant gods, a most hated ascendant god, the most hated ascendant goddess, the most hated ascendant goddesses, a most hated ascendant goddess, the most hated descendant god, the most hated descendant gods, a most hated descendant god, the most hated descendant goddess, the most hated descendant goddesses, a most hated descendant goddess, the most hated transcendent god, the most hated transcendent gods, a most hated transcendent god, the most hated transcendent goddess, the most hated transcendent goddesses, a most hated transcendent goddess, the most hated future god, the most hated future gods, a most hated future god, the most hated future goddess, the most hated future goddesses, a most hated future goddess, the most hated present god, the most hated present gods, a most hated present god, the most hated present goddess, the most hated present goddesses, a most hated present goddess, the most hated past god, the most hated past gods, a most hated past god, the most hated past goddess, the most hated past goddesses, a most hated past goddess, the most hated god, the most hated gods, a most hated god, the most hated goddess, the most hated goddesses, a most hated goddess, the most hated half god, the most hated half gods, a most hated half god, the most hated half goddess, the most hated half goddesses, a most hated half goddess, the most hated vessel, the most hated vessels, a most hated vessel, the most hated person, the most hated persons, a most hated person, the most hated image, the most hated images, a most hated image, the most hated belief, the most hated beliefs, a most hated belief, the most hated thought, the most hated thoughts, a most hated thought, the most hated word, the most hated words, a most hated word, the most hated action, the most hated actions, a most hated action, the most hated situation, the most hated situations, a most hated situation, the most hated circumstance, the most hated circumstances, a most hated circumstance, the most hated relationship, the most hated relationships, a most hated relationship, the most hated number, the most hated numbers, a most hated number, the most hated formula, the most hated formulas, a most hated formula, the most hated symbol, the most hated symbols, a most hated symbol, the most hated color, the most hated colors, a most hated color, the most hated thing, the most hated things, a most hated thing, the most hated way, the most hated ways, a most hated way, the most hated place, the most hated places, a most hated place, The most hated time. The most hated times. A most hated time. The most hated event. The most hated events. A most hated event. The most hated result. The most hated results. A most hated result.